Don't embarrass me. Her husband's whisper cut through the White House chandeliers like a blade. Everly said nothing, just handed the hostess an envelope he'd never seen. The scanner beeped, stopped, beeped again. The hostess's smile drained away. She looked past Everly's shoulder straight at a 4-star Admiral standing near the door. "Sir," she whispered. "She's here." The Admiral crossed the room in seconds, stopped in front of Everly, extended his hand. "Major Everly Vance, we've been looking forward to meeting you in person." Her husband's face went white as marble. "What?" The president looking forward to why? He had no idea. For 3 years, he'd called her career just logistics, laughed about it at dinner tables, never once asked what she really did. He was about to find out in front of 500 people exactly who he'd been sleeping next to all along, and nothing between them would ever be the same again. Everly Vance, 29 years old, standing in a hallway that smelled like history and floor wax and old money. The White House East Wing. Chandeliers dripping light onto marble. Marines at the checkpoint, spines straight as rifle barrels. ADs moving like they'd rehearsed every step since birth. "Don't embarrass me." Griffin's voice, barely above breath, but it landed like a slap anyway. She didn't answer, didn't turn her head, just kept walking beside her husband, heels clicking against stone that had heard 400 years of American secrets. He adjusted his medals, straightened the line of ribbons on his army service uniform like he was polishing a trophy he hadn't quite earned yet. Glanced at her. No smile. "Just stay close. Smile when you're supposed to. Tonight matters." She said nothing, because there was nothing left to say to a man who mistook her silence for surrender. At the check-in table, a young hostess in a navy blazer smiled the practiced White House smile. "Good evening. May I see your invitations, please?" Griffin produced his envelope like a magician pulling a rabbit, confidence radiating off him in waves. "There you go." The scanner beeped. Clean, green light. "Welcome, Colonel Vance." He nodded, tilted his chin up half an inch. That small, satisfied smirk he wore whenever the world confirmed what he already believed about himself. Then he looked at Everly, waiting. She reached into her handbag. Not for the invitation he'd watched arrive in their mailbox. 3 weeks ago, the one he'd photographed and sent to his mother and his brother and 2 men from his old command. Not that one. A different envelope. One he had never seen. The seal on it caught the chandelier light and threw it back gold. His eyebrows pulled together. "What is that?" She didn't answer. She handed it to the hostess. The scanner beeped once. Stopped. Beeped again. The hostess's smile drained out of her face like water through a cracked glass. She stared at the screen, checked it a second time, a third. Then she looked past Everly's shoulder, toward a 4-star Admiral standing near the doorway. Silver hair, posture like a flagpole. "Sir," her voice had gone careful. "She's here." The Admiral turned, and the moment his eyes found Everly, something in the room shifted. Conversations near them thinned out into silence, the way water pulls back before a wave. He walked toward her, purposeful, every step deliberate, stopped in front of her, extended his hand. "Major Everly Vance." Griffin's head snapped toward her so fast Everly heard his collar creak. "We've been looking forward to meeting you in person," the Admiral said, warm, genuine, the kind of warmth you don't fake for cameras. "It's an honor." People had stopped talking now, whole clusters of them. Griffin blinked. "What?" Everly held the Admiral's eyes. "The honor is mine, sir. The President will be glad you've arrived," the Admiral said. Beside her, Griffin went the color of the marble floor. She could almost hear it, the questions detonating behind his eyes one after another. The President. Glad. Why would the President? But before he could ask a single one of them out loud, everything changed. Because this story didn't start in this hallway. It started almost a year earlier, back when Everly still believed that patients could hold a marriage together by sheer force of will. Back when she still thought love and being seen were the same thing. They weren't. "My name is Everly Vance. I'm 29 years old, and for the better part of a decade, I have served this country as an Army logistics officer." Say that word to most people. Logistics. Watch their eyes glaze over before you finish the sentence. They picture spreadsheets, clipboards, A woman behind a desk counting boots. Even Griffin used to joke that I was the queen of inventory. I used to laugh at that joke. Not because it was funny, because laughing was easier than explaining the parts of my job I was never allowed to explain. Operational security wasn't a policy I followed, it was an oath I made. Signed my name to it, meant it. While men like Griffin stood at the front of every photograph, commanding units, giving speeches, shaking hands in front of flags, people like me worked somewhere behind the frame. Fuel routes, medical evacuation windows, aircraft scheduling that decided who lived and who didn't make the flight in time. Contingency plans nobody would ever thank me for, because if I did my job correctly, nobody would ever know there had been anything to prevent. When everything worked, nobody noticed. When something failed, everyone did. I told myself I preferred it that way. My father served 32 years in this army. Command Sergeant Major Desmond Bishop. Retired now, but retired the way a mountain retires. Still there, still immovable, still watching everything with those flat gray eyes that missed nothing. He used to sit across from me at the kitchen's table when I was a girl, coffee mug in one scarred hand, and tell me the same sentence so many times it became scripture. The best officers don't chase applause. They chase responsibility. I tried to live by that sentence, even after I married Griffin, especially after. Because when I met him at Fort Liberty, in a dining facility that smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner, he wasn't the man who whispered, "Don't embarrass me," in a White House hallway. He laughed easily, genuinely, from somewhere real. He knew the names of enlisted soldiers 3 ranks below him, used them, remembered their kids' birthdays, stayed 2 hours late, helping a nervous second lieutenant rewrite a training plan that wasn't even his responsibility. He admired people for what they were made of, not for what was pinned to their chest. That was the man I fell in love with. That man is still in there somewhere. I have to believe that. Because the alternative is that I spent 7 years married to someone who was always this way, and I simply hadn't been paying close enough attention to notice. But promotions change people. Not all people, not always. Sometimes, each new set of orders chipped something away from Griffin and replaced it with something harder. Every medal ceremony became another excuse to perform. Every rank pinned to his collar made him just slightly less curious about anyone else's life, especially mine. At a neighborhood cookout in Fayetteville, some wife I barely knew asked what I did for a living. Before I opened my mouth, Griffin grinned. Everly keeps everything organized. Laughter, warm, easy, oblivious laughter. So she's the organized one, someone said. I smiled. Something like that. Something like that. As if a decade of my life could be folded down into 4 small words and handed across a picnic table like a paper napkin. At his mother's dinner table, the introduction ran like a ceremony she'd rehearsed. My son is one of the brightest officers in the army. Then a gesture toward me. Barely a glance. And Everly works somewhere in logistics. Somewhere. As though my career were a rumor she'd half heard and couldn't quite verify. No one meant real harm. That's what I told myself, over and over, until the sentence wore smooth from repetition and stopped meaning anything at all. Griffin stopped asking what I did. Not in an argument. Not in a single decisive moment. It eroded, the way a riverbank erodes, one quiet year at a time, until one day I looked up, and the ground I used to stand on with him simply wasn't there anymore. He assumed every late night meant paperwork. Every secure call meant scheduling conflicts. Every sudden trip meant another dull conference in a hotel ballroom with bad coffee and worse lighting. He never imagined, not once, that some of those weeks decided whether thousands of American service members overseas received the fuel, the medicine, the extraction they needed to come home breathing. I couldn't tell him, not because I didn't trust him. Because I had signed my name to documents that made trust irrelevant. Because some things aren't mine to give away, not even to the man I promised my life to. So I carried 2 weights at once, the responsibility of the mission, and the loneliness of succeeding at something my own husband didn't believe was worth succeeding at. Looking back now, I can find the exact moment our marriage started to drift. It wasn't a single fight. It wasn't infidelity or cruelty or anything with a clean, dramatic name. It was quieter than that. Griffin didn't stop loving me. He fell in love with something else instead. Status. The day he pinned on Lieutenant Colonel, I stood in the front row of that ceremony and cried real tears. Proud tears. We had moved 4 times in 6 years, missed 2 of his sister's weddings, celebrated our 3rd anniversary over a laggy video call while I sat in a secure facility parking lot because it was the only privacy I had that week. That promotion felt like our victory. Both of ours. At least I thought it did. Then something shifted. Small at first. He started introducing himself by rank before name. Colonel Vance, nice to meet you, and only afterward, almost as an afterthought, Griffin. Every conversation, no matter where it started, found its way back to his command, his soldiers, his readiness numbers, his next evaluation. And whenever someone turned the conversation toward me, he waved it off like swatting a fly. Everly keeps busy with logistics, not army logistics, not strategic logistics, not the thing that had consumed a decade of my life and half my sanity. Just logistics, flattened into nothing. At a retirement dinner outside Arlington, white tablecloths, a string quartet nobody was listening to, a retired Marine colonel leaned across the table and asked where I served. Before I could answer, Griffin laughed. Nothing exciting. She makes sure people get their supplies. The colonel smiled politely, but something behind his eyes sharpened. I spent 30 years in logistics support myself, he said. Then he looked directly at me. That usually means you know where every skeleton in the command is buried. I smiled. We tried to prevent the skeletons in the first place. He laughed, genuine, appreciative laughter. Griffin didn't. On the drive home, headlights sweeping across empty highway, he stared through the windshield like it owed him an apology. You didn't have to impress him. I wasn't trying to. Sounded like you were correcting me. I answered his question. You know what I mean? No, I don't. But I stopped arguing. Because arguing cost more than it was worth, and because somewhere along the way I had learned that every disagreement, no matter how it started, ended with Griffin accusing me of being defensive, sensitive, competitive. Silence required less energy. Unfortunately, silence can also become permission. Months later, my responsibilities expanded. Selected for a joint planning initiative. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, 3 civilian agencies. All of it stitched together under a classification level that meant my personal phone stayed in a locker outside the building for 8, 10, sometimes 14 hours a day. What are you working on? Griffin asked one evening. Not curious. Bored. The kind of question you ask because silence in a room feels worse than a question you don't want the answer to. I can't talk about it. He rolled his eyes. So, paperwork. I nodded. It hurt less than explaining, again, why I couldn't explain. At dinner with his family that week, he joked to the table. The Army finally trusts her with bigger spreadsheets. Laughter around the table. Warm, easy at my expense. His mother beamed at him like he'd said something clever instead of something cruel. I'm just glad one of you has a career people can understand. I looked down at my plate, studied the pattern on the china like it might rearrange itself into something that didn't sting. My father's voice arrived in my head, uninvited, the way it always did in rooms like that one. Never measure your worth by the loudest person at the table. After dinner, my father-in-law followed me out onto the porch, handed me a mug of coffee I hadn't asked for. You never defend yourself, he said. Not unkind. Just observing. I don't see the point. He nodded slowly. My wife doesn't really understand military careers, but Griffin does. That sentence has stayed lodged in my chest ever since, a splinter I never quite dug out. Because he was right. Griffin understood exactly how important logistics could be to an operation. He'd studied it, briefed on it, depended on it his entire career. He simply didn't believe my work carried that same weight. He'd forgotten one of the oldest truths this uniform ever taught anyone. Victory belongs to everyone who made it possible, not just the ones standing in front of the cameras when the flag gets planted. Then, Washington called. I reported to the Pentagon the following Monday, 7 in the morning, badge clipped to my jacket, stomach in knots I refused to name as fear. Inside a secure conference room, 3 floors below ground level, the walls were covered in maps. I wasn't allowed to photograph and display tracking movements. I wasn't allowed to discuss over dinner. Senior officers around a long table, arguing in the clipped, efficient language of people who'd run out of patience for anything but precision. Supply routes, humanitarian corridors, evacuation contingencies, fuel depots that existed on paper and would need to exist in reality within 72 hours if certain scenarios came to pass. For months, my life folded itself into that room. Classified briefings that started before sunrise. Days that ended after the family across the street had already turned off their porch light. Griffin barely noticed. At another social function, another ballroom, another string quartet, nobody listened to someone congratulated him on his latest evaluation. Warm handshakes. A photo for the unit newsletter. Then the same person turned to me, polite, dutiful. "And how's work going, Major Vance?" Before I could answer, Griffin laughed. That easy practiced laugh he'd perfected for exactly this kind of moment. "Oh, don't get her started. Ask Everly, and she'll convince you logistics runs the whole army." Everyone around us chuckled politely. The way people chuckle at a joke they don't quite understand, but assume they should find funny because a colonel told it. I forced my mouth into the shape of a smile. Inside, something cracked. Quietly. The way ice cracks under weight it wasn't built to hold. Not because he'd embarrassed me. I was used to that by then. Almost fluent in absorbing it. Because he genuinely believed what he was saying. Because somewhere in the last 3 years, my husband had stopped seeing me as a person doing something difficult and started seeing me as a punchline he could reach for whenever a room needed warming up. Let me take you back further. To the exercise that started all of it. The one nobody wrote down. The one that never made it into any after-action report, with my name attached to the credit. It was a joint training rotation at Fort Liberty, 6 months before the Pentagon assignment. Cold October morning, breath fogging in front of every soldier on the flight line. A readiness exercise meant to simulate a rapid deployment scenario. Aircraft loading, fuel calculations. The unglamorous math that decides whether an entire brigade gets where it's supposed to go on time, or doesn't get there at all. Griffin's battalion was the centerpiece of the exercise. His name on the operation order. His face the one the visiting brigade commander would remember. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near that flight line that day. My section was running a parallel logistics simulation 2 buildings over. Nothing to do with his unit's readiness numbers. Except a fuel manifest crossed my desk that morning that didn't add up, just a few gallons off. The kind of discrepancy most people would round away and forget by lunch. I didn't round it away. Because 7 years of doing this job had taught me that discrepancies are never really about the gallons. They're about what the gallons represent. A miscalculation in aircraft weight distribution. A refueling window that wouldn't hold if the numbers on paper didn't match the numbers in the tanks. I walked the manifest over myself, found the fuel sergeant on the flight line, hands cold, clipboard shaking slightly in the wind. "Recheck tank 4, I told him. "Something's off by more than rounding error." He looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Ma'am, this isn't your unit, I know. Recheck it anyway." He rechecked it. It wasn't a rounding error. It was a valve malfunction that had been quietly overfilling one tank and underreporting another for the better part of 2 hours. Left uncorrected, the aircraft scheduled to lift 2 hours later would have taken off with a weight distribution that put it dangerously close to the edge of its safety margin. On a training exercise, that meant a scrubbed mission and an embarrassing incident report. In a real deployment, at altitude, under load, in weather. I don't like to finish that sentence, even in my own head. We caught it, fixed it. The exercise proceeded without a hitch, on schedule, textbook clean. That evening at the debrief, the visiting brigade commander shook Griffin's hand in front of 40 people. "Clean execution, Colonel. Damn near flawless timing on that fuel window." Griffin smiled. "Thank you, sir. My team worked hard on that." His team. I stood near the back of the room in my utility uniform, badge from an entirely different section clipped to my chest, and said nothing. Because correcting him in front of a brigade commander wasn't my job. Because I hadn't done it for credit. Because the mission mattered more than the story of who saved it. But that night, lying awake next to a man sleeping soundly beside me, congratulating himself in his dreams for a crisis he never knew existed, something in me went very quiet and very still. I had just prevented a catastrophe with my own 2 hands, on a flight line that wasn't mine, for a unit that wasn't mine, commanded by a husband who didn't know my name had ever been anywhere near it, and he was sleeping like a man who deserved every bit of that commander's praise. I didn't wake him to tell him. I lay there in the dark and asked myself a question I wasn't ready to answer yet. What exactly am I holding on to here? My father called 2 days later. He always seemed to know when to call. Some old soldier's instinct for timing that I never fully understood. "How's the army treating my daughter?" he asked. Same opening line he'd used since I was 18 years old and shipping out to basic training. "Fine, Dad." Long pause on his end. He'd taught me that pause too, though I never noticed. I was doing it back to him until he pointed it out once. Years ago, at Thanksgiving. "Fine's not an answer. Ev. Fine's a door you close, so people stop knocking." I told him about the fuel manifest, not because I wanted comfort, because he was the only person alive I could tell the whole truth to without editing it down to something smaller. He listened without interrupting. That was his gift, always had been. 32 years of listening to soldiers, half his age, try to explain things they didn't have words for yet. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You did the job right," he finally said. "That's the only thing that was ever going to matter in that room." "I know. Do you?" I didn't answer that one. "Griffin doesn't know," I said instead, and hated how small my voice sounded saying it. "He will," my father said. "Eventually. The truth doesn't stay buried forever, Ev. It just waits for the right room to stand up in." I didn't believe him. Not that night, I should have. Spring arrived the way it always does in North Carolina, all at once, and overwhelming dogwoods exploding white along the roads leading onto post. I remember the season mostly because of what it brought with it. A phone call, unlisted number, secure line, a voice I didn't recognize asking for Major Everly Vance by full rank and name, which already told me this wasn't a wrong number or a recruiter's cold call. "The Joint Task Force needs someone who understands multi-branch logistics coordination at scale," the voice said. "Your name came up." Repeatedly. I sat very still at my kitchen table, phone pressed hard against my ear, heart doing something complicated in my chest. "This would mean relocation to the Pentagon," the voice continued. "Extended TDY status initially, likely permanent change of station within the year, depending on how the initiative develops. Full read-in on clearances above your current level. I need to know if you're willing before I put your name forward formally." I looked around my kitchen. Griffin's uniform jacket draped over the back of a chair where he'd left it that morning, medals catching the window light, a grocery list in his handwriting on the counter, milk, eggs, the ordinary architecture of a marriage that existed in the spaces between everything I wasn't allowed to say. "Yes," I told the voice on the phone. "I'm willing." I hung up and sat there a long time before I told him. When I finally did, that night, over a dinner he'd barely looked up from, I chose my words carefully. "I've been selected for a new assignment. Pentagon. It's a significant opportunity." He chewed, swallowed, looked mildly interested the way you'd look mildly interested in a coworker's promotion. "That's great, honey. More logistics stuff?" Something like that. I didn't correct him, because I'd learned by then that some truths cost more to give away than they were worth to a man who wasn't going to ask a second question anyway. He got his own news 3 weeks later, and when he got it, the entire house knew about it within the hour. I remember the sound of him coming through the front door that evening, keys hitting the bowl on the entry table harder than usual, footsteps too fast for a man who usually walked like he owned whatever ground he stood on. Everly. I was at the stove. Turned around. He was holding a manila envelope like it was made of gold. "Battalion command," he said. "They're giving me battalion command." I set down the spoon. Genuine joy moved through me, unclouded, uncomplicated, the kind of pride you feel for someone you loved, before all of this started accumulating between you. Griffin, that's incredible. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and picked me up off the ground, laughing, spinning me once before setting me back down like I weighed nothing at all. Do you know what this means? Do you have any idea what this means? I do, I told him, and I meant it. This is huge. He called his mother before dinner was even finished cooking. Then his brother. Then 2 friends from his officer basic course who he hadn't spoken to in over a year. Every single call opened with the same 6 words. I just got battalion command. I stood at the stove and listened to him say it 4 times in a row, watched the pride in his shoulders straighten with each retelling, and felt something strange move through my chest. Not resentment, not exactly. Something closer to grief for a conversation that wasn't happening. The one where he asked me about the Pentagon, about what full read-in on higher clearances actually meant, about what kind of assignment gets a major relocated to Washington on an accelerated timeline. He never asked. Not that night. Not the night after. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself a lot of things that spring that turned out not to be true. I need to go back one more time. Because there's a piece of this that matters more than almost anything else in this story. 2 weeks before the invitations arrived, before Griffin's battalion command call, before any of it, I sat in a secure briefing room at the Pentagon and was told, for the first time, the actual shape of the assignment I'd said yes to on a kitchen phone call in North Carolina. The room held 6 people, 2 admirals, a 3-star general from the Joint Staff, a civilian I never learned the name of who took notes the entire time on a legal pad and said nothing else, and me. We have a developing situation, the general said, sliding a folder across the table that I wasn't allowed to take with me when I left. Overseas evacuation contingency, Allied diplomatic personnel, American service members, embedded civilian contractors, roughly 2,000 people across 4 extraction points, and intelligence suggesting the window to move them safely could close within 72 hours of activation. I read the summary page twice. We need someone who can coordinate multi-branch logistics at a scale and speed we haven't attempted since the 80s, the general continued. Aircraft, fuel, medical staging, route deconfliction across services that don't naturally talk to each other under pressure. Your name came up from 3 separate people who've worked with you. They all used the same word. Which word? I asked. Unshakable, he said. I sat very still. The weight of the folder in front of me, the weight of the room, the weight of 2,000 lives that existed right now as names on a page I wasn't allowed to keep. This is not guaranteed to activate, the general said. It may never activate, but if it does, you would be the one holding the center of it. Every branch reporting through your coordination cell. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my father's voice. The best officers don't chase applause. They chase responsibility. I thought about Griffin, at home, probably watching a game on the couch, completely unaware that his wife was sitting 3 floors underground, being asked whether she was ready to hold 2,000 lives in her hands. Yes, sir, I said. I'm prepared. I walked out of that room and drove home in silence, radar-free-foff, hands steady on the wheel, even though nothing else in me felt steady at all. I couldn't tell him. Not the folder. Not the 72-hour window. Not the 2,000 names I would spend the coming months learning to hold without letting my hands shake. I could only tell him the version that fit inside a sentence he'd accept without follow-up questions. It's a new assignment. Pentagon. It's a significant opportunity. He said, "That's great, honey," and asked if we had any milk left. That was the moment, if you want to know the exact moment, when the distance between us stopped being something that happened to us and became something I started carrying on purpose. Because the alternative was standing in my own kitchen, trying to explain the unexplainable to a man who'd already stopped asking real questions a long time before that phone call ever came. I want to tell you about the last dinner before everything accelerated, because it matters, because it's the moment I understood exactly how far we'd drifted and exactly how little either of us was doing to swim back. Griffin's parents came for dinner that Sunday, the last ordinary Sunday, the calm before the 2 envelopes and the Pentagon and the 72-hour window that was still. At that point, only a hypothetical folder in a room I wasn't allowed to describe. His mother, Marlene, arrived with a casserole dish and an agenda. She always had an agenda, even when she pretended not to. That evening's agenda was Griffin's battalion command, which he'd received 2 days earlier and which she had already told, by my count, at least 11 separate people. We should throw a party, Marlene said, setting the casserole dish down with the ceremony of someone placing a crown on a pillow. A real celebration. Griffin deserves it. He does, I agreed, and I meant it. Marlene turned to me, almost as an afterthought, the way she always did. And how's your little project going, dear? The Pentagon thing? Little project. 2,000 lives folded down into 2 words over a casserole dish. It's going well, I said. Lots of moving pieces, I'm sure, she said, already turning back to Griffin. Now tell me about your change of command ceremony. Have you picked a date? Griffin lit up. Talked for 20 straight minutes about ceremony logistics, guest lists, whether the brigade commander would attend, what he planned to say in his remarks. I sat there and ate my dinner and said almost nothing, and nobody at that table noticed the silence because my silence had become so ordinary to them it no longer registered as absence. It registered as furniture. After dinner, Griffin's father, Harold, followed me out onto the back porch the way he sometimes did, handed me a mug of decaf I hadn't asked for, and sat down in the chair beside mine with the slow deliberateness of a man who'd been rehearsing what he wanted to say. You seem tired lately, he said. I am tired. He nodded, looking out at the dark yard. Griffin tells us you're working long hours on something you can't talk about. I can't. He was quiet a moment. Then, in a voice softer than I expected, he said something that surprised me. My wife always said a marriage runs on 2 engines, he said. If one of them's working twice as hard as the other for a long enough time, it doesn't matter how strong that engine is. Eventually something breaks down somewhere. I looked at him. Are you telling me something, Harold? Or asking me something? He almost smiled. Bit of both, I suppose. I didn't answer him that night. I sat there in the dark, mug going cold in my hands, and thought about 2,000 names in a folder I wasn't allowed to keep, and a husband inside the house planning ceremony logistics for a promotion I was genuinely, unreservedly proud of him for. Both things were true at once. That was the hardest part. I wasn't the villain of my own resentment, and Griffin wasn't the villain of his own ambition. We were just 2 people standing in the same house, facing in different directions, and neither had noticed how long it had been since we'd turned to look at each other. The night the second envelope arrived, after Griffin had gone to bed still glowing, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my father. It was late, past 10, but he'd always told me his door was open at any hour for exactly this kind of call, the kind you make when you already know the answer and just need someone to say it back to you. He answered on the second ring, voice gravelly with sleep. He wasn't quite in yet. Ev, everything all right? I got an invitation to the White House, Dad. Silence on the line. Then careful, measured, the voice he used when he already suspected there was more to a story than the first sentence let on. That's not a small thing, Everly. What's the occasion? I can't say exactly, but it's connected to the assignment. The one I can't talk about either. Another pause. Longer this time. Does Griffin know? He finally asked. He has his own invitation, I said. He thinks it's for him. For his battalion command, I think, or just because of his rank. He doesn't know about mine. My father exhaled slowly, the sound of a man who had spent 3 decades reading rooms before he ever walked into them. You're going to have to decide something soon, Ev, he said. Not tonight. But soon, whether you're going to keep making yourself smaller so his story has room to breathe, or whether you're finally going to let your own story take up the space it's earned. I don't know how to do that without breaking something, I told him. My voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. Sometimes, he said, things have to break before they can get fixed right. You didn't build this house crooked, Everly. You just kept quiet while somebody else built it that way. That's not the same thing as being at fault, but it does mean you're the only one who's noticed it's crooked. And that means you're the only one who can say something before the roof comes down on both of you. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Didn't sleep much that night. Lay in the dark next to Griffin's steady breathing, listening to a man dream peacefully beside a wife who was quietly holding the outline of a future he had no idea was coming. Because in less than a season, that folder in the Pentagon basement would stop being hypothetical. Because the 72-hour window would open for real, and I would be the one standing at the center of it, coordinating an evacuation that would decide whether 2,000 people came home or didn't. Because the White House invitation sitting folded in my silverware drawer wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a formality, and it wasn't anything close to what Griffin assumed it was. And because somewhere in the middle of all of that, a marriage that had been quietly cracking for 3 years was about to be tested in a way neither of us could have imagined at that kitchen table, back when logistics was still just a word he used to make people laugh at parties. The invitations themselves arrived on a Tuesday in early autumn. 2 envelopes, heavy cream paper, embossed seals, pressed so deep into the cardstock you could feel the shape of the eagle with your thumb even with your eyes closed. Griffin got to the mailbox first. He always did, some competitive instinct left over from childhood that made him treat the walk from the front door to the curb like a race he had to win. "The White House," he shouted, loud enough that I heard him from the kitchen window before he'd even made it back up the driveway. "We've been invited." He held the envelope out in front of him like a lottery ticket, like something that might dissolve if he stopped staring at it. Called his mother from the front porch before he'd even taken off his shoes. Called his brother right after. Called the same 2 friends from Officer Basic, and this time the sentence had upgraded itself. "I've been invited to the White House. Not once. Not that evening, not the next morning over coffee, not at any point in the following 2 weeks." Did he notice the second envelope? The one addressed to me, beneath his. Different seal, subtly different, a protocol marking he wouldn't have recognized even if he'd looked closely, which he never did. I found it later that night, after he'd gone to bed, still glowing with the news, still replaying his mother's excited voice in his head like a song he wanted on repeat. I sat at the kitchen table with both envelopes in front of me. His already opened, already photographed and shared and celebrated, mine still sealed. I opened it slowly, read every line twice, folded it back along its original creases, and slipped it into the drawer beneath the silverware, the one Griffin never opened because he didn't know where we kept the good napkins. That night in bed, he was still talking, planning. "This is probably the biggest night of my career, Ev. Can you believe it? The White House." I looked at him in the dark. The shape of his face, familiar and unfamiliar at once, like a photograph of someone you used to know better than you know them now. "No," I told myself silently. "It isn't." He never heard me say it, because I never said it out loud. That was the last ordinary night we spent together as the people we used to be. In the weeks after the envelopes arrived, I watched my husband prepare for that evening with a devotion I hadn't seen from him in years. Not toward me, toward the idea of the room he was about to walk into. He had his uniform pressed twice at a dry cleaner across town that specialized in officers' dress greens, the kind of place with a hand-lettered sign in the window and a tailor who'd been altering hems for 30 years. He tried on the jacket in front of the bedroom mirror 4 separate evenings, adjusting the alignment of his ribbons by fractions of an inch, asking me each time whether it looked right. "It looks right, Griffin," I told him. Every time. And meant it mostly because it did look right, and because there was still some small stubborn part of me that wanted this night to matter to him the way he believed it was going to matter. He practiced introductions in the bathroom mirror. I caught him at it once, standing in the doorway with a towel in my hands, watching him extend an imaginary hand toward his own reflection and say, "Colonel Griffin Vance, it's an honor, sir," in a voice slightly deeper than the one he actually used in conversation. I didn't say anything. Just watched him for a moment, this man rehearsing a handshake with nobody in the room, and felt something complicated move through my chest. Tenderness, mixed with something closer to grief. Because I understood, even then, that he was preparing for a night that existed only in his own head. The real one was going to look nothing like it. At dinner, 10 days before the ceremony, He laid out his plan for the evening like a battalion commander briefing an operation. "We'll arrive early," he said, cutting into his chicken with the precision of a man discussing troop movements. "Not too early, fashionably early. Enough time to work the room before the formal program starts. I want to introduce myself to General Aldridge if he's there, and the Secretary's Chief of Staff if I can find an opening." I nodded along. "Sounds good. You should mingle too," he added, almost as an afterthought, "the way you'd remind a guest of the coat check. Talk to some of the wives. I'm sure there'll be a group of them somewhere." I looked down at my plate. Some of the wives. "I'm sure there will be," I said. He didn't notice anything strange in my voice. Why would he? I had gotten very good by then at keeping the strange things buried where he'd never have to trip over them. 3 nights before the ceremony, Griffin came home glowing, having just finished what he'd described as a phenomenal final walkthrough with the protocol office regarding his seating and his introduction to several senior officers he was hoping to network with that evening. They said the president might even shake my hand if the room's set up right, he told me, practically vibrating with excitement as he hung up his uniform jacket for the 3rd time that week. "Can you believe that, Ev?" The actual president. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched him. This man I had married 7 years earlier in a small chapel outside Fort Liberty, both of us barely out of our 20s, promising each other things neither of us fully understood the weight of yet. "That's amazing, Griffin," I said, and meant every word of it. "I really am happy for you." He crossed the room and kissed the top of my head, distracted, already moving on to the next thought. "You've been quiet about all this. Everything okay? Not stressed about the crowd or anything, are you? I know big events aren't really your thing." I looked up at him, studied his face for a long moment, familiar and unfamiliar at once. "I'm fine," I told him. "Just tired." He nodded, already turning away, already reaching for his phone to check something else related to the ceremony logistics that had consumed him for 2 straight weeks. I watched him walk out of the room and thought, with a strange, quiet ache that had nothing to do with anger, "You have no idea what's coming, Griffin. And in 3 days, neither of us is going to be able to pretend we don't see each other anymore." 10 days before the ceremony, I sat in on a final logistics briefing at the Pentagon regarding the event itself. Standard protocol for anyone receiving recognition at that level. In that briefing, I learned the full sheep of what was about to happen. The president's remarks, the photograph, the satellite imagery that would be shown publicly for the first time, declassified specifically for that evening, of the extraction corridors I had rerouted alone in a hallway at 2 in the morning during the operation that was still, at that point, weeks away from happening in this telling, but already decided, already scheduled, already written into a program I wasn't permitted to describe to my own husband. I would be seated separately from Griffin. I would be called to the stage. The entire operation, previously known only inside a handful of secure rooms, would become part of the public record that night, spoken aloud by the President of the United States in front of cabinet members, generals, senators, and my own husband, who still, even then, 10 days before it happened, believed the evening belonged to him. I drove home from that briefing, with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind anything but steady behind them, because there was still time to tell him, to sit him down and say, "Griffin, there's something you need to know before that night happens. Something that's going to surprise you, and I don't want you blindsided in front of 500 people." I thought about it for 3 days. And then I thought about 7 years of little logistics jokes told at dinner tables. About don't get her started at that ballroom function. About she keeps busy with logistics, flattened into nothing over a casserole dish. About a man rehearsing a handshake in a mirror for a room he thought was his. And I decided finally quietly, without anger, that some things aren't mine to soften anymore. He would find out the same way everyone else was going to find out. In that room, at that moment. The truth standing up, exactly the way my father always said it eventually would, in whatever room finally gave it the space to do so. The night before the ceremony, I couldn't sleep, lay awake beside Griffin's steady breathing, staring at the ceiling, running the last year back through my mind one more time. The way you replay a song you can't quite get out of your head. Around 2 in the morning, I got up quietly and went to the kitchen, opened the silverware drawer, took out my invitation, the one still folded exactly where I'd left it weeks earlier, and read it again by the light over the stove. Then I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd first said yes to a voice on the phone I didn't recognize. The same table where Griffin had once spun me around the kitchen laughing about battalion command, and thought about everything that had brought me to this exact night. The fuel manifest on a cold October flight line. The Pentagon phone call I said yes to before I told Griffin anything real about it. The 2 envelopes, side by side, one opened and celebrated, one sealed and silent. I thought about my father's voice, the one that had followed me through every hard decision of my adult life. The truth doesn't stay buried forever. It just waits for the right room to stand up in. Tomorrow, I thought, sitting alone in my kitchen at 2 in the morning, still in my pajamas, still holding an invitation with a seal Griffin had never once noticed sitting beneath his own. Tomorrow it stands up. I folded the invitation carefully, put it back in the drawer, exactly where it belonged, exactly where it had been waiting for months to be seen, and I went back to bed, and for the first time in what felt like a very long time, I slept without dreaming at all. Morning came gray and ordinary, the way the biggest days in a life often do, refusing to announce themselves with anything as dramatic as sunlight. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time, longer than I needed to, watched my own hands smooth down the front of a dress uniform I had worn to 100 forgettable events and would wear tonight to the least forgettable one of my career. Because somewhere behind my reflection in the bedroom, Griffin was humming, actually humming. Some tune I didn't recognize, cheerful and light, while he adjusted his medals in the mirror on his side of the closet, for what had to be the 4th time that week. "You almost ready?" he called out. "Car's coming in 20. "Almost," I said. I looked at myself one more time. At the woman in the mirror who had carried a folder full of names she wasn't allowed to keep, who had said yes to a voice on the phone before she told her own husband anything real about it, who had spent months building toward a night he still believed completely was his. "Tonight," I told her silently. "Tonight the room finds out who you are." I picked up my clutch, checked, one more time, that the invitation was inside it, folded carefully along its original creases, the seal catching the bathroom light. Then, I walked out to meet my husband, and the last ordinary hour of our marriage began. The call came on a Thursday, 3:17 in the afternoon. I remember the exact minute because I was standing in a Pentagon hallway, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, and my secure phone buzzed once against my hip, like a held breath finally released. Activation confirmed. 2 words on a screen. That was all it took to turn a hypothetical folder into the rest of my life. I didn't run. Officers don't run in hallways like this one, not even when the ground has just shifted under their feet. I walked. Fast. Faster than I'd walked in months. Past portraits of men who'd stood in rooms like the one I was heading toward and made decisions that outlived them by a century. Because the window was open now. 72 hours. Maybe less. And somewhere on the other side of the world, 2,000 people were about to find out whether the folder I'd read twice in a briefing room 3 weeks earlier was going to save their lives or fail them. The operations center looked nothing like the movies. No giant screens with dramatic red lines sweeping across a map. Just fluorescent light. Rows of monitors. The low, constant hum of people speaking in clipped, efficient sentences into headsets. A sound like a hive that had learned English. I found my station, sat down, put on my headset, and for the next 71 hours and 40 minutes, I did not leave that building. "Major Vance, coordination cell is yours," the general said, appearing at my shoulder just long enough to say 6 words that felt heavier than any rank insignia I'd ever pinned on. "Everyone reports through you." "Yes, sir." He walked away. Didn't wait for anything more. Because there wasn't time for anything more. I looked at the board in front of me. 4 extraction points. Names I wasn't allowed to say out loud to anyone outside that room. Aircraft schedules that had to interlock like gears in a watch too small to see the mechanism turning. Fuel windows measured in minutes, not hours. Medical staging areas that existed as tents on foreign soil, waiting. 2,000 people. I closed my eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Let my father's voice arrive, uninvited, the way it always did in rooms like this one. The best officers don't chase applause. They chase responsibility. Then I opened my eyes and picked up the phone. Hour 1. Coordinate with Air Force lift capacity. 6 C-17s available. Need 8. Hour 3. Naval Logistics offering 2 additional aircraft from a carrier group repositioning off the coast. Timeline tight. Fuel window closing in 11 hours if extraction doesn't begin by 400. Hour 6. Medical staging area at extraction point 2. Reporting equipment shortfall. Not enough stretchers. Not enough plasma. Sergeant Doyle, my only steady voice in that entire building. A logistics NCO with 15 years and a calm that never once cracked, leaned over my shoulder and said the sentence that became the rhythm of the next 3 days. We'll fix it, ma'am. One problem at a time. One problem at a time. Because that was the only way to survive 72 hours like that one. Not by looking at the whole mountain. Just the next handhold. Which meant I didn't sleep. Which meant I ate standing up. A protein bar in one hand and a phone in the other. 3 different conversations happening at once in my head, while my mouth managed a 4th out loud. Which meant somewhere around hour 11, a young captain from the Air Force Liaison Office looked at me with something close to panic and asked the question everyone in that room was thinking, but nobody had said yet. Ma'am, if the weather system moves in before extraction point 3 activates, we lose the window completely. What do we do? I looked at the board, at the 4 extraction points, at the weather radar creeping in from the northwest like a slow, patient hand closing into a fist. We don't lose the window, I said. We move it. Let me explain what that meant, because it's the part of this story that nobody in that ballroom, nobody at any of those family dinners, nobody who ever laughed at the word logistics like it was a punchline, ever understood. Moving the window meant recalculating 4 separate aircraft rotations in real time. It meant reallocating fuel reserves that had been earmarked for one extraction point and redirecting them on paper and in actual physical trucks driving on actual physical roads to a point that hadn't originally needed them. It meant calling a Navy logistics officer I'd never met at 2 in the morning his time and asking him to trust a plan I couldn't fully explain over an unsecured portion of the line. It meant making a decision, alone, because the general had gone to brief the Joint Chiefs, because the Admiral overseeing the operation was on a secure call with an ambassador I wasn't cleared to hear, because in that exact moment, in that exact room, the decision belonged to me, and there was no one standing behind me to make it instead. I remember my hand actually shaking over the phone, just for a second. Then, I thought about the folder, about the names in it, about 2,000 people who didn't know my name and never would, who were standing right now in the dark, somewhere waiting for a plan they'd trusted their lives to without ever getting to vote on it. I picked up the phone. Reroute extraction point 3 through the secondary corridor, I said. Effective immediately. I'm authorizing the fuel reallocation. Copy is going to record under my name. Silence on the other end for exactly 2 seconds. Copy that, Major. Rerouting now. I hung up. Sat very still for a moment in that fluorescent lit room full of people who had no idea what had just happened. Because if I was wrong, if the secondary corridor had a problem, nobody had flagged. If the weather moved faster than the radar predicted, people would die, and it would be my decision that killed them. I didn't let myself finish that thought, couldn't afford to, because there wasn't time to be afraid. There was only time to be right. Hour 18. Extraction point 3. Rerouted. Activated on schedule. Aircraft wheels up 11 minutes ahead of the closing weather window. Sergeant Doyle appeared at my station with 2 cups of coffee, set one down in front of me without a word, and looked at the board. You just moved 400 people out of a closing window on a decision nobody signed off on but you, he said. That's either going to be in a training manual someday or a court-martial file. No in-between with a call like that. I drank the coffee, It had gone cold already. Didn't matter. Which one do you think it'll be, Doc? He smiled, small and tired. Training manual, ma'am. Every time. I looked at him a moment longer than I needed to. 15 years in this army, and he'd never once made me feel foolish for asking a question twice or checking a number 3 times. There's a particular kind of gratitude that only exists between people who've watched each other hold a room together at 3 in the morning, and I felt it then, sharp and wordless, and went back to the board before it could turn into something I didn't have time to feel yet. Hour 22. A discrepancy appeared on the manifest for extraction point 1. Small at first. The kind of number a tired eye slides right past at 2 in the morning. I didn't slide past it. Because I had learned, on a cold October flight line 6 months earlier, that small numbers are never really small. They're just large numbers wearing a disguise. I flagged it. Pulled the manifest apart, line by line, while 3 other conversations ran simultaneously in my headset, one from Air Force liaison, one from a Navy coordination officer, one from Sergeant Doyle, relaying a supply update from a tent staging area 7 time zones away. Found it 11 minutes later. A miscount in medical personnel assigned to the first wave. 3 names duplicated across 2 different aircraft manifests, which meant 3 seats accounted for twice and 3 seats, somewhere in the actual physical world, not accounted for at all. I fixed it. Reissued the manifest. Moved on. Nobody in that room thanked me for catching it, because nobody in that room but Sergeant Doyle even fully understood what catching it had prevented. 3 people, standing on a tarmac somewhere, discovering there was no seat waiting for them after all. That's the job. Nobody claps for the catastrophe that didn't happen. Hour 26. I called Griffin. 2 minutes, standing outside the operations center in a hallway that smelled like bleach and burnt coffee, because I hadn't spoken to him in over a day, and some part of me, some small stubborn part that hadn't fully let go yet, needed to hear his voice. "Hey," he said. Sounded distracted. I could hear a television in the background. Sports commentary. "Everything okay?" "I'm fine. Just wanted to check in, long week." "Yeah, same here," he said. "Command's been a lot. You'll never believe what the brigade commander said about my readiness report today." He talked for 90 seconds about his readiness report. I stood in that hallway, 400 people in the air, behind a decision I'd made alone 8 hours earlier, and listened to my husband describe a compliment from his boss. "I have to go," I finally said. "Okay. Love you." "Love you too." I hung up and stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, because there was a version of that phone call where I told him, where I said, "Griffin, I just rerouted an entire extraction corridor and 400 people are alive right now because of a decision I made completely on my own 8 hours ago, and I am so tired and so scared, and I need you to just say something that isn't about your readiness report." I didn't say any of that, because he wouldn't have understood the words, even if I'd said them. Because operational security meant I couldn't have said most of them anyway. Because somewhere along the way, I had stopped expecting him to ask the right questions, and stopping expecting something is its own kind of grief, quiet and unannounced, the kind nobody sends flowers for. I went back inside. Extraction point 4 still had 30 hours left in its window. Hour 31. Marlene called Griffin's cell while he was showing the empty apartment. Really? Since I was 3 states away and only half listening through a headset during a lull, saw photos from a dinner party she'd hosted that weekend. I heard the sound of it through his phone, tinny and distant laughter and clinking glasses. He'd texted me a photo earlier that day, a slide from a briefing he'd given, his name at the bottom in bold letters, Colonel Griffin Vance, battalion commander. "Killed it today," the text said. I looked at that message for a long moment in a hallway 3 floors underground while a weather system I couldn't control crept toward an extraction point holding 600 people. I typed back, "Proud of you." I meant it. That's the thing nobody understands about a marriage like ours in that season. I could be proud of him and invisible to him at exactly the same time. Both things were true. Neither one canceled the other out. I put the phone away and went back to the board. Hour 38. A new problem. this one entirely outside anyone's control. A civilian contractor at Extraction Point 2, an older man according to the field report, refusing to board without confirmation his researched materials would travel with him. Understandable, in its way. A lifetime of work, thousands of documents, and a stranger's voice on a radio telling him there wasn't room. I listened to the field officer relay the situation, frustration bleeding through even the clipped radio discipline. "He's not going to move, ma'am. We're losing time we don't have." I thought for a second. Just a second. "Tell him we'll make room," I said. "Reduce non-essential equipment weight by the same margin. I'll authorize it." "Ma'am, that's cutting our fuel margin thinner than—" "I know what it's cutting. Do it anyway. A man's whole life's work doesn't get left on a tarmac if there's another option." Silence for a beat. Then, "Copy that, Major. Working it now." They found the option. Reduced equipment weight, recalculated the fuel margin down to numbers that would have made me nauseous to look at 24 hours earlier, and got the aircraft off the ground with the man, his research, and 6 minutes to spare before the corridor's outer safety limit. Sergeant Doyle looked at me after that one, something almost like a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You didn't have to do that." I looked back at him. Yes, I did. He didn't argue. 44. This is the part I don't tell most people. The part I've only ever told my father, and even then, only once, late at night, both of us too tired to perform strength for each other. Extraction Point 2 lost radio contact for 11 minutes. 11 minutes doesn't sound like much until you've lived inside it. Until every second of it stretches out sideways, thick and slow, while you stare at a screen that has stopped updating and try to remember how to breathe normally. Because radio silence in an active extraction corridor means one of exactly two things: equipment failure, or something worse. I stood at my station, both hands flat on the desk, and made myself breathe in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts. A trick my father taught me before my first deployment, back when I was 22 and terrified and trying not to show it. Sergeant Doyle stood beside me the entire 11 minutes. Didn't say anything reassuring. Didn't lie to me about the odds. Just stood there, a steady presence in a room that had gone very quiet very fast. Minute 4. Someone 2 stations over made the sign of the cross without seeming to notice they'd done it. Minute 7. I found myself gripping the edge of the desk hard enough that my knuckles had gone white, and made myself let go, made myself unclench one finger at a time, because panic in that seat wasn't just useless. It was contagious. Minute 9. Someone at another station said quietly, "We should prepare a contingency brief." I heard it, filed it away. Didn't respond yet. Because preparing for the worst before you've confirmed the worst has happened means you've already started grieving something that might still be alive. Minute 11. The radio crackled back to life. Equipment malfunction, a voice said, exhausted and relieved in equal measure. Backup unit online. All personnel accounted for. Repeat, all personnel accounted for. I don't remember sitting down. I remember Sergeant Doyle's hand on my shoulder. Briefly, the only physical comfort anyone offered me in 72 hours, and I remember thinking, very clearly, in a voice that sounded almost like my father's, "You don't get to fall apart yet. Not yet. There's still 2 extraction points left." So I didn't. Hour 52. Extraction Point 1 complete. 640 personnel safely staged. Aircraft en route home. The room let out something close to a collective breath when that confirmation came through. Not celebration yet. Just the smallest loosening of a knot that had been tightening for 2 straight days. I allowed myself exactly 30 seconds to feel it. Then I looked at the board. 3 points down. 1 to go, and it was the tightest window of all 4. Hour 61. Extraction Point 3 complete. 412 personnel. The same 400 whose corridor I'd rerouted alone in a hallway at 2 in the morning. All of them accounted for, all of them alive, because a decision nobody signed off on turned out to be the right one. I thought briefly about the version of this story where it hadn't been, where the secondary corridor had a problem nobody flagged. I let myself think about it for exactly as long as it took to be grateful it hadn't happened, and then I put it away, because there was still work left. Hour 68. Extraction point 2. Complete. The point that had gone silent for 11 minutes. The point that had, for 11 of the longest minutes of my life, existed only as a stalled cursor on a screen and a held breath in a room full of strangers. Complete. Accounted for. Alive. Hour 70. Extraction point 4, the final one. The one with the tightest window. The one I'd been watching the weather radar for like it was a living thing trying to reach through the screen and take something from me. I stood at my station and watched the last confirmation come through. All personnel extracted. 0 casualties, mission complete, 2,000 people. 0 casualties. I sat down very slowly in my chair. Sergeant Doyle appeared beside me again, set another cup of coffee down. This one I actually drank. "You did that, ma'am," he said quietly. "Every piece of that. You did that. We did that," I corrected him. "Every one of us in this room." He smiled. Tired, genuine. "That's exactly why you're the one who's going to get called upstairs for it, because you'll never once say it was just you." I didn't understand what he meant yet. Not fully. Not until the phone call that came 4 days later. "I want you to understand something about those 72 hours, because it matters more than the mission itself, more than the aircraft and the fuel windows and the decision I made alone in a hallway at 2 in the morning. I want you to understand what was happening 3 states away, in a house with a porch light Griffin never remembered to turn on, while I was holding 2,000 lives together, with headsets and coffee and a calm I had to manufacture from nothing every single hour. Because on the second night of the extraction, while I was standing at a station, listening to radio silence stretch into its 9th agonizing minute, Griffin was hosting a dinner party. Not a small one. He'd invited his parents, 2 officers from his battalion staff, a visiting colonel from brigade headquarters, who Griffin had been trying to impress for months. I know this because Marlene sent me photos the next morning, cheerful, oblivious, captioned with exclamation points. "Wish you could have been there. Griffin gave such a wonderful toast." I opened those photos standing in a hallway. I hadn't left in almost 2 full days, still wearing the same uniform. Hair pulled back so tight it had started to give me a headache I'd stopped noticing hours earlier. In the photo, Griffin stood at the head of our dining room table, wine glass raised, mid-toastite, laughing at something someone had said. Behind him, on the wall, a photo of the 2 of us from our wedding, 7 years younger, both of us smiling like nothing in the world could touch us. The caption under the photo, from his own account, posted publicly, read, "Great night celebrating with the team. Proud of what we're building." I stood there and read that sentence 3 times. We're building. While I sat 2 floors underground, rerouting an evacuation corridor by myself, because there was no one else in the room to make that call. I didn't cry. There wasn't time to cry, and even if there had been, I don't think the tears would have come. I think I was too tired for them. Grief needs a certain amount of energy to fully arrive, and I'd spent every ounce of mine on 400 people in a corridor that needed to move before a weather system closed in. I put the phone away, went back to my station. Because the mission wasn't finished yet. Because somewhere out there 600 more people were still waiting on a decision only I was positioned to make. Because that's the job. That's always been the job. You do it whether or not anyone at the dinner table 3 states away knows your name is anywhere near it. Hour 72 officially. Mission complete, confirmed, logged, filed under a classification I still can't discuss in full even now. I walked out of the Pentagon into daylight that felt foreign against my skin after 3 days under fluorescent light, stood in the parking lot, car keys in my hand, and did the only thing that felt honest in that moment. I called my father. "It's done," I told him, before he'd even finished saying hello. 0 casualties, everyone's home. Silence on the line. Then, in a voice thick with something I'd rarely heard from him in 29 years, he said, "I'm proud of you, Everly. More proud than I have words for right now." I started crying then. Standing in a parking lot, exhausted past the point language could reach, finally letting 3 days of held breath out, all at once. "Does Griffin know?" My father asked gently. Once I could speak again. "No, Are you going to tell him? I looked up at the sky, gray, unremarkable, the kind of sky that doesn't know it's hanging over the aftermath of something enormous. I can't tell him the details, I said slowly, working the thought out loud as I found it. But I think he's about to find out anyway. Just not from me. I drove home that evening in a kind of exhausted daze, the world outside the windshield moving past like it belonged to a story I wasn't quite in yet. Griffin was already home when I walked through the door, sitting on the couch, a game playing quietly on the television. He looked up. "Hey, stranger, rough week?" "Long week," I said. He didn't ask what made it long, didn't ask why I looked the way I looked, hollowed out and wrung dry in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary fatigue. He turned back to the television. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, and felt something settle inside me that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not anger, not exactly. Clarity, because I understood, standing in that doorway, that I had just spent 3 days holding the lives of 2,000 people in my hands, and my own husband hadn't noticed I'd been gone in any way that mattered. I went and took a shower, stood under water hot enough to sting until it ran cold, and let myself feel every single thing I hadn't had time to feel for 72 hours. Then I got out, dried off, went to bed, and 2 days later, the phone call came that changed everything. Admiral Foster Langley. That was the name on the caller ID, a number I didn't recognize attached to a rank that made my stomach drop before I even answered. "Major Vance," he said. Once I picked up, "I wanted to reach out personally before the formal notification comes through channels." "Yes, sir. The operation you coordinated last week," he said. "It's already being reviewed at levels well above the Joint Task Force. 0 casualties across 4 extraction points under a 72-hour window is not something that happens by accident, Major. It happens because someone in the center of it made every right call, over and over under conditions most officers never face in an entire career." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table. "Thank you, sir." "There's more," he continued. "The White House has requested a recognition ceremony, presidential level. You'll be receiving formal notification within the week, but I wanted you to hear it from me first, because I suspect very few people in your life currently understand the scope of what you just accomplished." I closed my eyes, thought about the 2 envelopes that would arrive weeks later, sitting side by side in my silverware drawer, about Griffin's, already opened, already celebrated, already photographed and shared with everyone he knew, about mine still sealed, still unread by anyone but me. "Sir," I said carefully, "my husband and I will both likely be invited to whatever event this becomes. Is this same event most likely the Admiral confirmed? Though I imagine he won't yet know why you're actually on that guest list." "No, sir, he won't." A pause on the line. Then, in a voice that carried something close to gentleness, the Admiral said, "Major Vance, in my experience, the people who do this job the way you just did it rarely need anyone to notice. But some things deserve to be seen anyway, whether the person who did them wants the attention or not." I thanked him, hung up, sat at that kitchen table for a long time alone, in a house where my husband was down the hall, watching television, completely unaware that in a matter of weeks, the entire architecture of what he believed about our marriage was about to come apart in a room full of chandeliers and cameras and people who already knew exactly who I was. The weeks between that phone call and the ceremony passed strangely. Time moves differently when you're carrying a secret that large. Every ordinary moment gets a strange double exposure to it. Griffin talking about his change command ceremony at dinner, while I sat across from him, knowing that in a matter of weeks, we'd both be standing in the East Wing, and only one of us would be surprised by what happened there. I went back to my regular assignment, debriefs. After action reports I wasn't allowed to write in full detail. A quiet return to the ordinary rhythm of a job that had, for 72 hours, been anything but ordinary. Sergeant Doyle found me in the hallway outside the operations center one afternoon, about 2 weeks after the extraction, and handed me a folded piece of paper without a word. "What's this?" I asked. "Something I wrote down during hour 30, he said, middle of that radio silence with .2. "Figured you might want it someday, or might not." Your call. I unfolded it later, alone, in my car in the parking garage. It was a single sentence, written in his careful, blocky handwriting. Watched a woman hold 4,000 pounds of pressure on her shoulders for 3 straight days, and never once let it show on her face. Whatever they end up giving her for this, it won't be enough. I sat in that car and cried for the second time in 2 weeks. Not from exhaustion this time. From something closer to being seen, fully, by someone who understood exactly what it had cost. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my wallet, where it stayed. I want to tell you about one more evening, before the envelopes arrived, because it explains something about why I made the choices I eventually made. About why I never sat Griffin down and told him what was coming. It was a Sunday, about 10 days after the extraction wrapped, before the Admiral's call, before any of it had a shape yet. Griffin and I were at a promotion ceremony for one of his fellow battalion commanders, standing in a crowd of dress uniforms under a gray autumn sky on a parade field at Fort Liberty. Afterward, at the reception, a lieutenant colonel's wife I'd met a handful of times over the years struck up a conversation with me near the refreshment table. "Everly, right, Griffin's wife?" she asked. "I hear you work at the Pentagon now. That's wonderful. What is it you actually do over there?" Before I could answer, Griffin appeared at my elbow, drink in hand, already laughing. "Don't get her started," he said. "The same line, the same practiced ease. She'll have you filling out requisition forms before you know it." The woman laughed politely. I smiled the smile I'd perfected over 3 years of moments exactly like that one. But something in me, standing on that parade field 10 days after I'd rerouted an evacuation corridor alone at 2 in the morning, 10 days after 11 minutes of radio silence that had aged me more than the 3 years before it combined, went very still. Because I realized, in that moment, that Griffin wasn't being cruel. He genuinely believed the joke he was telling. He had no idea there was anything beneath it worth knowing. And I understood, standing there with a warm drink in my hand and a husband laughing at my expense in front of a stranger, that there was no version of this conversation where I explained it to him gently, in private, over dinner, and he understood the scope of what he'd been missing. Some truths are too large to hand someone quietly. Some truths need a room. A big one. Chandeliers, witnesses. He was going to get his room. He just didn't know it yet. Griffin's excitement about the White House event, as a Zanst event, grew louder as the date approached, exactly the way I'd expected it to. He had his uniform pressed twice. Asked Marlene 3 separate times whether his medals were arranged correctly. Practiced small talk in the bathroom mirror, rehearsing handshakes with nobody, preparing for a night I already knew was going to look nothing like the one playing out in his head. I let him have those weeks. Let him plan his seating strategy and his network of introductions and his imagined handshake with the president. Not out of cruelty, out of something closer to mercy, the last mercy I think I had left to give him at that point in our marriage. Because once that room stood up, there would be no more planning left for either of us. Only reckoning. The night before the ceremony, after I'd sat alone in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, reading my invitation by the light over the stove, I lay awake a long time beside him, listening to his steady, untroubled breathing. I thought about the 2,000 names in a folder I was never allowed to keep. About a fuel manifest on a cold October morning. About 11 minutes of silence that had felt like 11 years. About a man asleep beside me who still believed, completely, that tomorrow night belonged to him. Tomorrow, I thought, it stands up. And then finally, mercifully, I slept. The morning of the ceremony arrived gray and ordinary, the way the biggest days in a life often do, refusing to announce themselves with anything as dramatic as sunlight. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time, longer than I needed to. Watched my own hands smooth down the front of a dress uniform I had worn to 100 forgettable events, and would wear tonight to the least forgettable one of my career. Because somewhere behind my reflection in the bedroom, Griffin was humming, actually humming. Some tune I didn't recognize, cheerful and light, while he adjusted his medals in the mirror on his side of the closet, for what had to be the 4th time that week. "You almost ready?" he called out. "Car's coming in 20. Almost," I said. I looked at myself one more time. At the woman in the mirror who had spent 72 hours holding 2,000 liveys together with headsets and coffee and a calm she'd had to manufacture from nothing, who had rerouted an evacuation corridor alone in a hallway at 2 in the morning, who had gone home afterward to a husband who hadn't noticed she'd been gone. Tonight, I told her silently. Tonight the room finds out who you are. I picked up my clutch, checked, one more time, that the invitation was inside it, folded carefully along its original creases, the seal catching the bathroom light. Then I walked out to meet my husband, and the last ordinary hour of our marriage began. The car ride to Washington took 40 minutes. Griffin talked for almost all of them. About the seating he'd been told he'd have, about which senators might attend, about a joke he was workshopping for small talk, something about battalion readiness numbers that he'd already tried on me twice that week, and I'd laughed at twice, both times a little thinner than the time before. I watched the city lights start to gather outside the window, felt my own pulse climbing steadily, not with fear exactly, something closer to the stillness before a jump. "Nervous?" he asked at one point, glancing over. "A little," I said, honestly. He reached over and squeezed my hand. "You'll be fine, just stay close to me tonight. Smile when you're supposed to." I looked down at our joined hands, at the wedding ring I'd worn for 7 years, at the small pale scar along his knuckle from a training accident years before Fort Liberty, back when we were young enough to think every scar had a good story attached to it. I heard my father's voice arrive, quiet and certain, the way it always did right before something important. The truth doesn't stay buried forever. It just waits for the right room to stand up in. I looked back up at Griffin, at the profile of a man rehearsing handshakes in his head, and said the only honest thing I had left to give him before everything changed. "I'll try." He smiled at that, took it as reassurance. Didn't ask what exactly I was trying to do. The East Wing hallway hit us the way it always hits everyone the first time. Marble underfoot. Chandeliers throwing gold light across walls lined with portraits of presidents who had once stood exactly where we were standing. Marines at the checkpoint, spines like rifle barrels. ADs moving with a precision that made every step feel choreographed. Griffin straightened his jacket one final time, glanced at me, that small satisfied smirk already forming, the one he wore when the world was about to confirm everything he already believed about himself. "Don't embarrass me," he said, barely above a whisper. I didn't answer, didn't turn my head, because there was nothing left to say to a man who still, after everything, mistook my silence for obedience instead of what it actually was. Patience running out of road. We passed under a chandelier the size of a small car, its light fracturing across the marble in 100 directions at once. Somewhere ahead, a string quartet played something quiet and formal. I recognized the melody but not the name of it, the way you recognize a face from a dream you can't fully place. I thought, walking beside my husband down that hallway, about every version of this evening I had imagined over the past several weeks. None of them had prepared me for how heavy the air actually felt, thick with perfume and cologne, and the low hum of 500 conversations happening at once. None of them yet about me. That was about to change. At the check-in table, the hostess smiled the practiced smile of someone who had said the same sentence 400 times that evening already. "Good evening. May I see your invitations, please?" Griffin produced his envelope with the confidence of a man who had never once doubted his place in a room. "There you go. Clean beep, green light. Welcome, Colonel Vance." He nodded, turned to me waiting, that small triumphant smirk already settling into place. I reached into my clutch. Not for the invitation he'd photographed and shared with his mother and his brother and 2 men from Officer Basic. Not that one. The other one. The one he had never once noticed sitting beneath his in a drawer full of good napkins he didn't know we owned. His eyebrows pulled together. "What is that?" I didn't answer. I handed it to the hostess. The scanner beeped once, stopped, beeped again. Her smile drained out of her face like water, through a cracked glass. She checked the screen a second time, a third, then looked past my shoulder, toward a 4-star Admiral standing near the doorway with posture like a flagpole. "Sir," she said, voice suddenly careful. "She's here." The Admiral turned, And the moment his eyes found me, the room around us shifted, the way water pulls back before a wave. Conversations thinned into silence in a widening circle. He crossed the floor with purpose, stopped in front of me, extended his hand. Major Everly Vance. Beside me, Griffin's head snapped around so fast I heard his collar creak. "We've been looking forward to meeting you in person," the Admiral said, warmth radiating off every word. "It's an honor." People had stopped talking entirely now. Griffin blinked. "What?" I held the Admiral's eyes. "The honor is mine, sir. The President will be glad you've arrived," the Admiral said. I watched Griffin's face lose every bit of color it had gained from the champagne we hadn't even had yet. He looked at me, then at the Admiral, then back at me, the President, looking forward to seeing her. Why? He didn't get to finish forming the question before everything moved. A protocol officer appeared at Griffin's elbow, polite, unhurried, entirely unmoved by whatever silent panic was rearranging his face. "I'm sorry, sir. Your seating assignment is this way." "My wife is with me," Griffin said, and something in his voice had gone thin, almost pleading. "I'm aware," the officer said. "Major Vance has separate seating arrangements." Silence. Complete silence. I looked at Griffin for the first time since we'd walked through the door. He searched my face, desperate for an explanation, for anything that might make the last 30 seconds make sense. I offered him none, because there had been too many years of unanswered questions between us for this to be the moment I finally answered them all at once, standing in a hallway, in front of strangers, with a scanner still humming somewhere behind us. The Admiral offered his arm. "If you'll come with me, Major." I went. I didn't look back. I want to be honest about that, because there's a version of this story where I glance over my shoulder one last time, some soft cinematic gesture of reassurance. That's not what happened. I walked forward toward the East Room and let my husband disappear behind me into a crowd that no longer had any idea what to make of him. The East Room stretched out ahead of us, rows of chairs beneath a ceiling I'd only ever seen in photographs. Cabinet members, Joint Chiefs, members of Congress, families of fallen service members seated with the particular stillness that grief teaches a person. Humanitarian representatives, recipients of past honors, sitting straighter than everyone around them, out of some old habit that never quite goes away. This wasn't a simple reception. This was one of the most significant recognition ceremonies of the year, and I was about to become the reason for it. The Admiral escorted me to the second row. Several senior officers rose as I approached, which nearly stopped my heart on its own. A Vice Admiral I'd never met in person smiled warmly. "It's good to finally put a face to the name, Major." A general shook my hand. "My staff speaks highly of you, consistently." The director of a logistics agency I'd worked with only over secure video calls laughed outright. "I was beginning to think you weren't real." I smiled at each of them, something unsteady happening in my chest. Because most of these people knew me only as a voice through a headset, a signature on an authorization, a name attached to a decision made alone in a hallway at 2 in the morning. An older woman 2 seats down leaned toward me as I settled into my chair. Silver hair pinned neatly, a small gold star pin on her lapel that I recognized immediately, the kind given to families who had lost someone in service. "You're the one from the extraction," she said quietly. Not a question. I hesitated. "I can't really discuss the details, ma'am." She patted my hand. Once, gentle. "You don't have to. I just wanted to say thank you. My son didn't come home from something like what you did. It matters more than you know. That other mothers got theirs back, because someone like you was in the room." I didn't trust myself to answer that with words. I nodded instead, throat tight, and she nodded back and turned her attention to the stage, leaving me to sit with something far heavier than nerves for the next several minutes. Across the room, 8 rows back, Griffin stood frozen, staring. His commanding general leaned toward him. I watched it happen even from that distance, watched Griffin's mouth move, watched the general's eyebrows lift. "Griffin, do you know Major Vance personally?" "She's my wife," Griffin said. I could see the words leave him, automatic, hollow. The general's eyebrows climbed higher. "You never mentioned that." For perhaps the first time in 7 years of marriage, My husband had absolutely nothing to say. The president entered with the Secretary of Defense. The anthem played, the room rose, then settled, and the president approached the podium with the unhurried gravity of someone who understood exactly how much weight his next words were about to carry. Tonight, he began, we recognize Americans whose names rarely appear in newspapers. I kept my eyes fixed on the podium, felt my pulse in my throat. The men and women whose planning, discipline, and quiet professionalism protect service members and civilians around the world. A satellite image appeared on the screen behind him. Extraction corridors. Route markings I recognized instantly, because I had drawn versions of them myself, weeks earlier, in a room 3 floors underground. Many of tonight's honorees worked under strict classification, the president continued. Some could not tell their own families what they were doing. They accepted that burden willingly. Murmurs moved through the room now, soft and rising. Last month, one coordinated logistics operation prevented what experts believed could have become one of the largest personnel crises involving American service members in recent memory. I heard someone near me inhale sharply. Planning that mission required extraordinary leadership across every branch of our armed forces, the president said, and one officer consistently refused individual recognition for it. My stomach tightened, the same way it had tightened 11 minutes into radio silence at Extraction Point 2. The president looked toward my section. Major Everly Vance, would you please join me on the stage? Across the room, I watched Griffin turn. Watched, from a distance, the exact moment my husband finally understood. Because the White House invitation had never been his story. It had always been mine. I stood as the room rose around me, applause breaking like something physical against my chest. The Admiral beside me whispered, "You've earned this, Major." "I didn't do it alone," I whispered back. "I know," he said. "That's exactly why you're the one standing up." The walk to the stage felt endless and instant. At the same time, the way important moments always do, my heels against the floor sounded impossibly loud in my own ears. Though I know now that nobody else in that room heard anything but applause. I passed the general who'd interrogated Griffin minutes earlier, and he nodded at me once, something like respect settling into his expression that hadn't been there a moment before. The president shook my hand, his grip firm, genuine. "Major Vance, the nation owes you its gratitude." "It owes my team, sir," I said, "every one of them." He smiled. "That's exactly what everyone told me you'd say." Soft laughter moved through the room. He turned back to the crowd. "Last month, intelligence suggested an Allied evacuation could collapse within 72 hours, he said. Analysts estimated thousands of American service members, diplomatic personnel, and civilians could become stranded across 4 extraction points. The room had gone completely silent now. The response required unprecedented cooperation across every military branch, coordinated in real time under conditions few officers ever face in an entire career. Major Vance held the center of that response. Applause struck the room again, louder this time. Because of her leadership, he said, not a single American life was lost. The applause that followed lasted long enough that I had to look down at my hands to keep from crying in front of 500 people. Because every piece of credit in that sentence belonged to more people than could ever fit on one stage. Pilots, medics, a logistics sergeant named Doyle, who'd stood beside me through 11 minutes of radio silence without once letting his voice shake. Young enlisted soldiers loading aircraft in the dark on the other side of the world, none of whom would ever stand where I was standing now. A civilian contractor who refused to leave without his life's work, and a field officer who found him room anyway, because I told them to. I accepted the medal with both hands, felt the weight of it settle against my collarbone, colder and heavier than I'd expected. Stepped to the microphone. I wasn't expecting to speak, I said. A few gentle smiles moved through the crowd. But there's something I'd like to say. I found my father's face in my mind before I found any words in my mouth. Found too, the fuel sergeant on that cold October flight line, the young captain who'd asked, "What do we do when the weather closed in?" The old woman 2 seats down, with the gold star pin, who'd thanked me before I'd even opened my mouth. My father served in this army for 32 years, I said. He taught me that leadership isn't measured by how many people salute you. It's measured by how many people succeed, because you quietly did your job. Several veterans in the crowd nodded, slow and certain. I accept this on behalf of the people whose names will never appear in a headline, I continued. The mechanics, the planners, the medics, the radio operators, the families waiting at home for a phone call that finally comes. They're the reason missions succeed. They're the reason people come home. The applause that followed was the longest of the night. When I stepped back, the president leaned toward me, voice low enough that only I could hear it. You just made my speech better. I doubt that, sir. I don't, he said. The ceremony continued another hour. I don't remember most of it in detail, the way you don't remember most of the moments, right after something enormous happens to you. I remember faces, handshakes, a Navy captain telling me his grandson wanted to become a logistics officer after hearing my remarks, and how that single sentence meant more to me than the medal now sitting heavy and unfamiliar against my chest. I remember the old woman with the gold star pin finding me again near the edge of the stage as the program moved on to other honorees, pressing a small folded piece of paper into my hand. For you, she said. Read it later. Not now. I didn't open it until much later that night, alone, but I want to tell you what it said, because it's the sentence I've carried with me longer than almost anything else from that evening. It said, "Thank you for being the reason someone else's mother didn't have to feel what I felt. That's the only medal that matters." I remember other honorees being called that same evening, names I recognized from the operation itself. Some I didn't recognize at all, each one a story I would never fully know but understood, in that room, as part of the same larger fabric I'd been quietly threading through for months. Afterward, guests moved into the reception rooms, chandeliers throwing warm light across marble and champagne glasses, and quiet, satisfied conversation. The Admiral found me first. "You've become very popular tonight," he said, something like amusement in his voice. "I'd rather disappear," I told him honestly. He laughed. "I believe that, which is exactly why the Army needs more officers like you, and considerably fewer who need the applause." He left me with that, and I stood near a tall window overlooking the south lawn, metal still cold against my collarbone, and finally let myself breathe. Then I saw him. Griffin stood alone near the same window, several feet away, watching the dark grounds outside like they might offer him an explanation nobody in that room had given him yet. All the confidence he'd worn walking through the East Wing hallway 2 hours earlier was gone, stripped away the way a tide strips sand from a shoreline, leaving something rawer underneath. When our eyes met, he walked toward me slowly. "Everly," I waited. "I didn't know," he said. "I know." "No." His voice cracked slightly. "I really didn't know. I know, Griffin." He looked down at the floor between us. "I thought logistics meant paperwork." "You thought my logistics meant paperwork," I repeated, quiet, not cruel, just true. He closed his eyes. "I was wrong, you were. I embarrassed myself tonight," he said. I shook my head, slow and certain. "No, Griffin, you embarrassed yourself long before tonight." His shoulders dropped. "I never saw you," he whispered. That sentence hurt more than anything else he could have said, because it wasn't cruel. It was simply finally true. "I saw your rank," he said. "I saw your job title. I never stopped to actually see you." I looked at him for a long moment. This man I had married in a small chapel outside Fort Liberty 7 years earlier, both of us young enough to believe every promise we made that day was permanent by default, requiring no maintenance, no attention, no work. "You know what the strangest part is?" I said. "I never once needed you to understand what I did. I needed you to be curious about it. Those aren't the same thing, Griffin. You can respect someone's job without understanding a single detail of it. All it takes is asking." He didn't have an answer for that. Before either of us could say anything more, his commanding general approached, the same man who'd raised an eyebrow at Griffin 2 hours earlier. "Griffin," he said. "Sir." The general looked between us, then sighed, a long, tired exhale that carried more disappointment than any raised voice could have. "I've known Major Vance's work for almost a year," he said. "The operation she led saved careers." He paused, corrected himself with a firmness that landed like a verdict. No, it saved lives. Griffin stared at him. You knew? Yes, the general said simply. And somehow you never once realized the remarkable officer you came home to every evening. He wasn't angry when he said it. He sounded disappointed. That was worse. I want to spend a moment on something the general said next, because it stayed with me longer than I expected it to. Son, he said, and there was something almost fatherly in the word, the way he used it. I've watched a lot of officers rise through this army. The ones who last, the ones who actually become something worth following, they figure this out early. Rank is a responsibility you're given. It's not a mirror you get to hold up to yourself at dinner parties. The moment you start using it that way, you've already started losing something you won't get back easily. Griffin didn't say anything, just nodded, slow, like a man absorbing a blow he knew he deserved. The general nodded once to me, offered a quiet major, and walked away, leaving Griffin standing in the silence he'd left behind. Finally, my husband asked the question that had been burning behind his eyes since the check-in table. Why didn't you tell me? Because I legally couldn't, I said. I understand that. I turned toward him fully then, for the first time since we'd walked into that building. But even if I could have, I said, I'm not sure you would have listened. His eyes filled, and the first time since I'd known him, there was no rank in his posture. No medals catching the light. No performance for a room that might be watching. Just a man, standing very still, finally confronting the difference between admiration and respect, and beginning slowly to understand that one had never been able to replace the other. People think revenge is loud. They imagine shouting, slammed doors, public humiliation, delivered with enough force to make someone hurt exactly as much as they've hurt you. A year earlier, I might have believed that too. But standing in the White House with a medal I never asked for pressing cool against my collarbone, I understood something I hadn't expected to learn that night. The greatest revenge wasn't making Griffin feel small. It was finally, after 7 years, seeing myself clearly. For so long, I had measured my marriage by how much patience I could absorb without complaint. I told myself endurance and love were the same thing. That if I worked harder, stayed quieter, understood more than I asked to be understood in return, eventually Griffin would see me. The truth turned out simpler than that, and far less comfortable. People don't suddenly learn to value what they've spent years overlooking. Sometimes they have to lose it first. Whether Griffin was about to lose me completely, I honestly didn't know yet, standing there in that reception room. But I knew, with a certainty that settled into my chest like something solid finally set down, that the woman who walked out of that building tonight was never going to be the same one who'd walked in. As the reception thinned and guests began drifting toward the exits, I stood near the entrance, breathing in cool spring air. Washington lights reflected against pavement, still wet from an earlier rain. Behind me, footsteps. I was hoping you hadn't left yet, Griffin said. His voice sounded different. Not commanding. Not performing. Just tired, in a way I recognized because I'd been carrying that exact tiredness myself for months. I've been thinking, he said. I imagine you have. I owe you more than an apology. I looked at him. I owe you years of respect I never gave you, he said. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. When we met at Fort Liberty, he finally continued, I admired everything about you. You were smarter than me, calmer than me. I knew that even then. So what changed? I asked. He looked down at the wet sidewalk. I started chasing promotions. Somewhere along the way, I started believing my rank made me more important than the people standing next to me. He laughed, short and bitter. I spent years teaching young officers about servant leadership. I wasn't practicing it at home. That honesty mattered. Excuses can be rehearsed, polished, delivered with the same confidence he'd worn through the East Wing hallway 2 hours earlier. Honesty usually can't be. I don't expect forgiveness tonight, he said. You shouldn't, I told him. I just wanted you to know, he said. His voice cracked once more. I'm ashamed of the husband I've been. I nodded. Once. Slow. I believe you're ashamed, I said. I don't know yet if that's the same thing as being different. Shame doesn't automatically become change, Griffin. Sometimes it just becomes a very convincing performance of change for a while, until the audience stops watching. He flinched at that, and I let him. Because it was true, and because I had spent too many years softening true things for him already. Then I walked away. Not because I hated him. Because healing doesn't happen in a single conversation, no matter how honest it is. Real change takes time. And time was the one thing I could no longer hand over on faith the way I'd handed over 7 years of it already. I drove home alone that night. Griffin had come with the official car service, and I'd arranged quietly, days earlier, for my own transportation back, some instinct in me already understanding I might need to leave that building on my own terms, at my own pace, without an audience. The drive back to Virginia took just over an hour. I don't remember much of the highway. I remember the medal sitting in its velvet case on the passenger seat beside me, and I remember thinking, somewhere around the halfway point, that I had spent the entire evening being seen by 500 strangers, more completely than I had been seen by my own husband in 3 years. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes after a night like that. Not the exhaustion of the 72-hour extraction, sharp and adrenaline-driven. Something slower. Something that settles into your bones over the following days rather than announcing itself all at once. I got home before Griffin did. He'd stayed behind to speak with a few more officers, networking out of habit, even in the wreckage of the evening, and I let myself into a quiet, dark house and sat at the kitchen table with the medal case in front of me for a long time before I finally went to bed. I didn't cry that night. I think I'd used up whatever tears I had left standing in that parking garage weeks earlier, reading Sergeant Doyle's note for the first time. I just sat there, in the quiet, and let the last year finally catch up to me. The months that followed moved our lives in different directions, the way rivers do once they've been diverted from a shared channel. I accepted a teaching assignment at the Army Logistics University in Virginia, mentoring young officers preparing to carry the same invisible weight I'd carried for a decade. It surprised me how much I loved it, how much lighter it felt to hand someone else the tools instead of always being the one holding the line alone. On the first day of every class, I wrote the same sentence across the whiteboard. Leadership begins with respect. Then I asked my students what it meant to them. The answers were never the same twice, and I never got tired of hearing them. One young lieutenant, barely 23, raised her hand during my second week of teaching and said something that stayed with me for a long time afterward. "Ma'am, I think it means being willing to be the person nobody claps for." I looked at her a moment. "Where'd you learn that?" She shrugged, a little embarrassed. "I read about the extraction operation last spring, the one they finally declassified parts of. I looked up who led it. I didn't say anything for a moment. Just nodded and told the class to open their manuals to Chapter 4, and didn't trust my voice again until the lesson had moved well past that particular exchange. Griffin requested a transfer out of command. Nobody forced him into it. He told me, in one of the few conversations we still had during that period, that he wanted to rebuild the kind of leader he used to be, before ranks started rearranging his priorities without his permission. He enrolled in a leadership counseling program on his own, something I only learned about secondhand, through Marlene, who called me once that spring sounding smaller and more uncertain than I'd ever heard her. "He doesn't talk about the White House ceremony much," she told me. "What does he talk about?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. The day he realized he'd stopped listening to the person who knew him best. That sentence sat with me longer than I expected it to. Because it sounded like more than an apology. It sounded like the beginning of something he actually intended to keep. Marlene, to her credit, said something else that day I hadn't expected from her either. "I introduced you wrong. All those years," she admitted, voice unsteady, "somewhere in logistics. Like it was nothing. I'm sorry, Everly. I didn't understand what I was dismissing. I didn't need the apology to be complete or perfectly worded. I just needed it to be honest, and it was. Thank you for saying that," I told her. We saw each other occasionally during that stretch. Griffin and I. Not as a couple exactly. Not yet, if ever. More like two people carefully renegotiating the terms of a friendship that used to be something larger. He came to one of my classes once, unannounced, standing quietly at the back of the room during a session on evacuation contingency planning. I saw him there, near the door, in civilian clothes, watching me teach a room full of young officers about the exact kind of work he'd spent years calling paperwork. I didn't stop the lesson for him. Kept teaching, walking my students through decision trees and fuel margin calculations, and the particular kind of calm required to hold a room together when a corridor goes silent for 11 minutes. Afterward, as the students filed out, he approached slowly. "That was incredible," he said. "I had no idea it was this complicated. Most people don't," I told him. "That's kind of the point." He looked around the empty classroom, at the whiteboard still bearing my handwriting. "Leadership begins with respect. You still write that every class?" "Every single one," I said. He nodded, something working behind his eyes. "I think I finally understand what it means." "Good," I said. "Now go practice it somewhere that isn't a classroom." He almost laughed at that, almost. 8 months after the ceremony, my phone buzzed with a text I hadn't expected. "Would you meet me?" No expectations, just coffee. I stared at it for a long time. Long enough that the screen dimmed twice before I finally typed back. 1 hour. We met at a small cafe overlooking the Potomac, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that changed too often for anyone to memorize. No uniforms, no medals, no cameras. Just two people who had once promised each other a lifetime, sitting across a small table with 2 cups of coffee going cold between them. He looked healthier than I remembered Calmer. Older, though not in years. Older the way people get when something finally forces them to stop performing and actually sit still with themselves. He didn't begin with an apology. He'd already given me that, standing outside the White House, 8 months earlier, and I think we both understood there was no version of repeating it that would carry any more weight the second time. Instead, he asked about my students. I told him about the young lieutenant who'd looked up who led the extraction operation, about the whiteboard sentence, about how strange it felt, some days, to be the one handing down wisdom, instead of the one quietly absorbing everyone else's assumptions. I asked about his new unit. He talked carefully about the counseling program, about a mentor he'd been assigned, an older colonel who'd apparently spent their first session asking Griffin one question and letting him sit with it for the rest of the hour. "What was the question?" I asked. He looked down at his coffee. "He asked me to name one thing about you I'd learned in the last year that I didn't already know before we got married." "And what did you say?" "It took me 3 sessions to answer him honestly," Griffin admitted. "The first 2 times I gave him things I already knew. Safe things. Things that made me look like I was paying attention. The 3rd time, I finally told him the truth. I didn't know anything new about you, because I'd stopped asking a long time before that." We laughed briefly, unexpectedly, about our first apartment near Fort Liberty, the one with an air conditioner that never quite worked and a kitchen table that doubled as a desk for both our careers at once, back when we were still building something instead of around each other. For the first time in years, the conversation felt equal. As we finished our coffee, he reached into his jacket pocket. "Found this while cleaning out my desk," he said, and handed me a small, worn photograph. It was from the week we graduated officer candidate school. Both of us standing side by side, younger, unguarded, no medals, no impressive assignments waiting yet. Just 2 people smiling at a future neither of us could have predicted would look anything like this. "I miss those 2 people," he said quietly. "So do I admitted. "I don't know if we can ever become them again." I looked at the photograph a moment longer, at the version of myself who hadn't yet learned to carry 2,000 lives in silence, and the version of him who hadn't yet learned to mistake rank for worth. "We shouldn't," I finally said. He looked up, surprised. "We're supposed to become better," I told him. "Not go backward. Better." He was quiet for a long moment, turning that over. "Do you think we can?" he finally asked. "Become better. Together, I mean, not just separately." "I don't know yet, Griffin." I told him honestly, and I think that's the most honest answer I can give you right now. I'm not interested in going back to who we were. If there's something worth building going forward, it has to be something neither of us has tried yet. Real curiosity, real listening, not performance. I can try that, he said. Trying is a start, I said. It's not a guarantee. I know, he said. I'm not asking for a guarantee. I'm asking for a chance to actually try, this time with my eyes open. That was the last thing either of us said before we stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. And I honestly don't know, even now, whether that conversation was an ending or the quiet, uncertain beginning of something neither of us had a name for yet. I want to tell you what happened a year after that coffee, because I think it matters, even if it doesn't tie the story into the kind of neat bow people sometimes expect from an evening like the one at the White House. Griffin and I didn't rush back into what we'd had before. We didn't move back in together within weeks, didn't repair 7 years of quiet erosion with a single honest conversation over cold coffee. What we did instead was slower, and I think, in the end, more honest. We started having dinner once every 2 weeks. Just the two of us, no agenda, no performance. He asked questions about my work that actually required follow-up questions of his own, the kind of curiosity he'd let atrophy for years. I asked about his counseling sessions, about what he was learning, about the young lieutenants under his new command, and whether he was practicing, in real time, the leadership philosophy he'd once only taught from a podium. Some of those dinners were hard. There were nights I left angrier than when I'd arrived, old resentments surfacing in ways neither of us had fully processed. There were nights he said something that reminded me sharply of the man who'd once told a room full of strangers that I made sure people got their supplies. But there were other nights, too. Nights where he asked me to explain fuel margin calculations just because he wanted to understand, not because he needed the information for anything. Nights where he sat quietly and let me talk about the 11 minutes of radio silence without once trying to fix it or minimize it or turn the conversation back toward himself. Slowly, carefully, something began rebuilding between us. Not the same structure as before. Something with a different foundation entirely. Whether our marriage survives, in the end, isn't the most important part of this story. Some endings don't fit neatly inside a single chapter. Some take years to finish writing, and some never fully close at all, and I've made a kind of peace with that uncertainty that I couldn't have made a year earlier, back when I still believed patience alone could hold two people together, no matter how far apart they'd drifted. What matters is this. Griffin became a humbler officer. I became a stronger woman, and neither of us ever confused rank with worth again. I think about that hallway often. The White House chandeliers. The scanner beeping twice before it finally understood who I was. The look on Griffin's face when an Admiral crossed a crowded room just to shake my hand. But more than that, I think about the 72 hours nobody in that room ever saw. The fuel manifest on a cold October flight line. The decision I made alone at 2 a.m, with my hand shaking over a phone. 11 minutes of radio silence that felt like 11 years. A dinner party captioned "We're building," posted by a man who had no idea what was actually being built 3 states away without him. I think about the old woman with the gold star pin and the note she pressed into my hand. Thank you for being the reason someone else's mother didn't have to feel what I felt. I think about my father's voice, steady across every hard year of my life. The best officers don't chase applause. They chase responsibility. And I think about the sentence I wrote on a whiteboard every single semester for a new class of young officers who reminded me, more than they'd ever know, of a version of myself who once believed love and being seen were the same thing. Leadership begins with respect. Never underestimate the quiet person in the room. The people who seek the least attention are often the ones carrying the greatest responsibility, the heaviest weight, the longest hours nobody photographs and nobody applauds. Titles fade eventually. Uniforms get folded away and stored in closets nobody opens anymore. Medals gather dust in drawers. But character is what people remember, long after the ceremony ends, and the chandeliers go dark, and the room empties out into an ordinary Washington night. And sometimes the person standing silently beside you isn't small at all. They're simply disciplined enough never to announce their own importance. They're simply waiting for the right room to finally stand up and see them. And if you're the one still waiting for that room, for that recognition, for someone in your own life to finally turn and truly see you after years of being overlooked, I want you to hear this clearly from someone who waited a long time herself. You don't need the room to stand up for your worth, to be real. The work you do quietly, without applause, without anyone photographing it, or posting about it, or toasting to it at a dinner table you weren't invited to sit at, that work still counts. It counted before anyone in a chandeliered hallway ever noticed it, and it will keep counting long after the medal gets put away in a drawer and the story stops being told. Some rooms take years to stand up in. Some never do at all. But you were never waiting for permission to matter. You mattered the whole time.